Okay, so just 3 quick disclaimers. The first one is this presentation was originally conceived as a 3-hour workshop to be delivered last year at OEB, which was not possible. So for this talk, it was cut short and to make things possible under 1 hour. So we had to lose quite a few moments for interaction. So it's a lot less interactive, and I had to lose some content as well. So it's a bit less detailed and a bit less comprehensive. Which leads me to the second disclaimer, which is even though it's a very important topic, we're not going to cover cost, just because cost alone would require quite some time, and then just to have to do it, it would probably be worse. So we decided not to address that. But at the end, I do intend to give you at least some simplified, or maybe some even some oversimplified take on this topic. And third, this is, I think, an important disclaimer. If training or online training, better yet, if online training is more like a compliance matter to you, then probably this isn't going to be very profitable for you. So this talk is probably not for you. Now, if you really want training to be effective, like if you really want your training to teach the right things, the right way, for the right results, then you're in for getting something useful, probably. If it's just about compliance, then it's going to be a waste of time. Because if all you care about is compliance, then it means that training for you is a commodity. Then you're gonna be just looking for the thing that can help you check a box for the lowest price. And that's not the case here. So when we talk about the scopes as such a big and key topic, or better yet, a key procedure, something that we actually have to do, then it requires effort, knowledge, time, sometimes to some degree investment, depending on how big the project is. So yeah, so just bear in mind that what we're going to be talking about here is things that really, really have a purpose and aim at delivering concrete, tangible results. So disclaimers made, then we can move forward. Starting as usual, because of course in this case it is say the most basic thing we can ever think about, which is the definition. I know it sounds super cliche, like, okay, so let's first understand what such something is, right? But in this case, it really matters because I'll try to derive quite a few activities or topics or principles out of each element of this definition. So I'm used to saying that scope is everything, and that's because of the short relationship that scope has with the notion of quality from a project management perspective. So from this perspective, if you take ISO as a reference, so scope in its most literal meaning means the boundaries and applicability of, say, a system or a product or a service or an activity, but it boils down to the boundaries and applicability. Now, quality is very, very similar because it has to do with the degree to which something, that this something can be also a system, a product, a service, an activity. So the degree to which this something or the set of inherent characteristics of this something can fulfill requirements. So that's quality. But at the same time, it's scope. Because scope is driven by quality to set the boundaries and its applicability, so that quality can measure how well you do stuff, while scope is about what is part of it and what's not part of it. So scope, because of this definition, so scope is necessarily entails value proposition, because your value proposition when you're designing this something that in our case here is a e-learning project. It could be an online course, for example. The value of this online course has to be entailed by the scope. Otherwise, it means your scope is not say done properly, because then you're scoping something that's not it won't deliver what you promised. Scope is also, as I said before, all but only the required work. So at the same time, that's very comprehensive, should be comprehensive. So it should include everything, but everything should only should this means that it should be as lean and concise as possible. And this is a big thing. We're going to be, developing more of this idea later on. This is a big thing because when you scope the wrong way, which to my experience is the majority of cases, you scope courses based on subject. So I'm going to do a course on effective communication. And then when you base your scope on a topic, the topic itself is limitless, is never ending. Like you can spend hours or days or weeks or months or whatever amount of time indefinitely talking about the same stuff. So where do you draw the line? So if you just go like, okay, let's just overdo it, let's just overkill, because then it's better to be safe than sorry. Then we should have a bigger scope, and then at least we can be sure that we're going to be covering the value proposition. So that's a very bad practice, because in reality things cost money and time to be done. So if you do that, you're going to be wasting time and money. So your scope is flawed if you don't add only the required work. But now, how do you discover what the required work is? So that circles back to value proposition. So value proposition for sure should be part of it, part of your scope. I have other constraints, which is basically time, money, and many other things such as regulations. So there are some things that you have absolutely to cover in order to be compliant. And sometimes it's the opposite. There are certain things that you cannot do for you to be compliant. So that also should be taken into account when scoping the projects. Just to emphasize, I'll be going through the content as if it was a talk for the most part. I'm going to stop a few, here and there to ask questions, to ask you to interact using the chat. But even if I don't stop at any point, feel free to drop a line, drop a question. I'm happy to take them, to answer them. Okay, so and then maybe Becky or Rolf can stop me and ask your question. So feel free to stop me at any time. And finally, and then circles back to the definition I was talking about. So it's about the boundaries, and also not just boundaries, but applicability. So meaning that scope is meant to do something, to deliver something, and that something is the quality of your work, which again circles back to value proposition. So I have to make sure that your scope is comprehensive. The entire value proposition is contained in your scope being delivered, but only that. So that's the key takeaway here. And then if you besides say managing or directing or whatever role you have, you also have your hands directly into the development of or conceiving or development, or at any stage of e-learning projects. I would be willing to bet that most of you come across this supposed opposition between Eddie and Sam. So supposedly, the one Eddie is more linear, more like waterfall, and Sam is more agile. So this is not true for many reasons. So I'll just talk about two of them that has to do with the scope. So one is this approach is not, these two things are not related to actually designing online courses. They're mostly related to project management. So these are just two different approaches to how you manage your project rather than how you design the solution. The designing process is very similar in any case. And second, because in terms of scope, how you scope, either using Eddie or Sam or any other, the steps that are going to be covering here, they apply regardless. And a good analogy here is what you see on the screen. A glass of water versus a jar with another glass of water, maybe a smaller one because it's MVP. So when you're scoping in a more sequenced or sequential way, everything, let's say water is your scope. So whatever is inside the glass is part of your scope, whatever is outside is out of scope. So that's simple and easy enough to understand. But the illusion that we have when you go into more agile approaches is that anything outside of the glass is out of scope, and that's not true. So inside the glass is your MVP, is the very minimal stuff you're going to do to deliver something that later will be iterated. But then everything else in your backlog is also your scope, part of your scope. The difference is more like, then we can think about this in another way, which is you can imagine an inverted pyramid, so with the top facing down, and then say that's your agile approach. It looks like a coffee filter or whatever. So when you have so much stuff in your backlog that when you're pouring everything to that vessel, everything that's, let's say each axis of this is like, say one is time, the other one is budget. So whatever cannot be covered by the time you have available and the money you have to spend, then it's going to overflow, and that these things that will be overflowing, these things indeed are out of your scope because they cannot be done. So that's why you have to prioritize. That's why your backlog, regardless of how big or small it is, best practice is it's always scoped, just well described, and prioritized. And in a more sequential way, you just pour whatever you have to pour inside the glass and you're done. But the procedure of selecting, describing, and prioritizing stuff to be inside the glass or inside the jar or inside the glass, regardless, it's the same. So don't worry about Eddie, don't worry about Sam, don't worry about any other approach to product management or to course design or whatever framework you use to be creative. Regardless, this approach to scope, will still going to be helpful to you. Now that I think about it, this is kind of a disclaimer also, isn't it? Okay, so moving on. So the first thing when you're scoping, the first thing you should think, and this is a kind of a sequential thing for scoping. Like if you screw up with the sequence, you're very likely going to do something that you shouldn't, or not do something that you should. So the first thing is to define why, what you're going to do, for what. So if you, again, our case here is for e-learning, for online courses. So use the chat. Just like to read a few ideas from your side. If you haven't heard about performance gap, opportunity gap, or skill decay, it's okay. You can just give it a go. Just give it a try. So use the chat to try and guess, if you don't know it, what performance gap means, what opportunity gap means, what skill decay means, and why defining these things is important. And then Becky and Rolf can highlight a few of your comments for me because I can't see you.
Okay, so there is one comment, and I think, yeah, there is one comment saying, can you repeat the question? But maybe there are also two more answers. So maybe we'll get clear about that. But maybe after these answers, you can maybe repeat one more. So one answer was based on needs assessments, which is always critical for every educational program. And another answer was performance gap, what the learners should do but are not doing yet, or not in the way you want them to. And saying the performance gap again, the difference between what is needed and what you can deliver. And another one should say knowledge needed to perform better. And there was one for opportunity gap, saying what you have a lot of but is not used yet. And one from Jeff as well for prevent skill decay, saying getting old. Well,
well, he's not wrong. Okay, yeah. So I'll repeat the question, but then I'm gonna move on. So my question was, if you could guess the definition, like what performance opportunity gaps are and what skill decay is. So what are these things and why they matter? Why do we have to define what we're aiming for before we continue with our scoping work? So it's important to know these three things, because they're gonna impact the way and how the way you scope, and also to some degree the size of your scope. So in terms of governance and yeah, from a more managerial perspective, performance gap is more or less what you read in the chat. So it's when you were supposed to be doing something a certain way and you're not. So it could be in terms of compliance, or it could also be in terms of result. So you had, such and such goals, but you're not performing as well. So you're, falling short. So you're not delivering the results that you were supposed to. So performance gap is about improving the way you do things, upskilling or learning something you still don't know, or maybe it needs clarification so that you can do better at something. Now, opportunity gap is when you're lacking entirely a skill because it's not your role yet. So this applies again, if you think in terms of from the managerial perspective, when you have in your organization, when you have an opportunity gap, it means that whatever it is that you deliver as a product or as a service, it either doesn't have market fit anymore, or you won't have it anymore in the short term. So like very famous cases, as probably you can think of many others. So say Blockbuster back in the day was, a huge network of stores, and all of a sudden it lost market fit because of Netflix and other streaming platforms. So Blockbuster missed to close an opportunity gap, because it could have launched its own streaming platform, and that was their opportunity gap. So they had to close that gap to stay relevant in the market. So that usually means a huge reorganization in your company, in your organization, to maybe reskill people, to create new sets of skills, to learn new things, to repurpose, to restaff people, change or learn how to use new tooling. So maybe there's this new tool that's revolutionary and nobody knows how to use them. So that's usually an opportunity gap. So it's not like you're not delivering currently. So it's not like you're not meeting your current goals, which is the performance gap. But if you don't do anything in the near future, you're gonna be either out of business, or you're gonna start having performance gap because you ceased to close. You didn't close an opportunity gap. And skill decay is when you don't have, say, you're already at your very best. Let's say you're very sharp in terms of knowledge and skill and everything else. But this is also coming from a common misconception. So we tend to think that the more we do something, and the more you do something, the better you are at it. The more experienced you are, the more knowledge you become, the more skilled you become, and that's not necessarily true. So what really makes you sharp and makes you elite at whatever it is you do is when you have consistent, frequent, challenging practice. This practice could be real life, because you're day to day challenged all the time and again, especially challenged with things that you still don't know, or still at either at the edge of your current knowledge and skill, or maybe slightly below further. That drives your ongoing development. So if you don't do that, if you're in your, say, quote unquote, comfort zone, and then you just do your day-to-day job, no meaningful challenge, nothing, then you're very likely, this is not just an opinion, this has been well documented for over 20 years probably, then your skill actually decays, it drops, so you're less good at what you do over time. The aviation industry is probably the one that knows this best, and it was probably the one that initiated the research on this area. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't matter how experienced you are in piloting, you still have to go through mandatory recurrent training in flight simulators, for example. So for the purpose of this scope here, we're going to be focusing on performance gap. Okay, so as I said before, so performance gap is the difference between your actual performance and your expected performance. And again, we're not going to tackle opportunity gaps and skill decay. It's a different use case. But in principle, for the most part, it should also at least get you started, because the logic still applies, just the procedures and the sequence you're going to do stuff that can be slightly different. So performance gap it is. So once you decided that, once you have very clearly established which application you have, then you step into defining the boundaries and applicability, the first step. So the first thing you do, there is a procedure for that. This is a framework to work with. Probably if you Google it, you're going to find not just plenty of examples of action mapping, but this is really just one framework. So if you find something else that works best for you, it's all good, as long as everything else contained inside of it is also accounted for. So the first thing you do is to define the requirements and the metric of each requirement. Again, remember, scope is all about requirements, all about the boundaries and applicability, which in basic terms means defining requirements. So the most basic requirements of these are the obvious ones. And even the obvious ones are not so obvious if you really think about it. So the obvious ones are the ones related to learning, right? Of course, it's an online course, so you would expect as the end result that somebody learned something, right? So, but of course, at the same time, this is not enough. So it's not like you just hope that somebody will learn something. So we want to make sure that the right people learn the right thing and learn it well, and then whatever it is that they learn is applicable to a particular job at hand. So that's why we split this into 3 categories of learning goals. So learning effectiveness, which has to do with if they will learn or not, if they really are going to learn and how well they're going to learn, and if this learning is going to be long lasting, so the quality of the learning, but also if they're learning the right things. So are they learning the most relevant things for the job at hand? And lastly, okay, in terms of, remember what I said before, so keep it as lean as possible, because when people are joining your training, it has a double cost. Usually has a cost because they're purchasing the course, purchasing the training if it's not for free, and it costs the company because instead of working, they're studying. So you have to make sure that the time they spend is really well spent. Then you have functional requirements, which is basically how the course is going to work. How, not just the course, maybe even the learning management system to some degree. Non-functional requirements, so this is a good thing to distinguish. So functional requirements usually they have to do with how the system works, while non-functional requirements they have to do with which constraints the system have to deal with. So basically, how fast does it have to be, how safe, how reliable, how scalable, et cetera, et cetera. For example, let's say your training supposedly counts on a synchronous delivery, like a synchronous talk. Is it really necessary to be synchronous? Because if it's lecture based, can it be scaled? Can it be turned into a course that people can take at their own pace? If not, why not? So this kind of requirements, and also any other kinds of constraint, budget, time frame, availability, anything. It could be even regulations, any other constraint that have to take into account when scoping. And lastly, the impact on quality. Again, circling back to the definition, quality in our case is a performance gap. So if I'm aiming at closing a gap in terms of performance, that necessarily means that my requirements concerning quality, they have to address job-related metrics. Again, that's why, again, circling back to the previous slide, that's why I have to define your application first, so that you know which type of requirement I have to add here at this stage. Okay, now a quick exercise for you guys to use in the chat. So I'm gonna go through these definitions again really quickly, just so I have time to think. And then your task is to come up, brainstorming. It doesn't matter if you know this already because you've done it before, or if you did, or if you never heard of any of these requirements. It's fine. Just based on this rough definition, try to brainstorm, even create, if you will, possible metrics to measure these requirements, if your goals have been achieved or not. The goals with your course, right? If building a course has achieved these results or not. So again, learning effectiveness have to do with how well you learn. Learning efficacy has to do with learning the right things. Learning efficiency, the speed, how fast you can learn, if your course is lean or not, or if it's overly big. Functional and non-functional requirements. Like one is about how the course should work in terms of navigation. For example, I'm not gonna give you too much practical tips, otherwise I'm gonna spoil the metrics. Non-functional requirements can be compliance, or any constraint that the system has or the course has to account for. Any other constraint, and impact on job-related metrics. So I'm gonna give you, say, 2 minutes back here. Ralph, is that okay on your side? Yeah, 2 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
Before you use the chat.
Check the comments. Yeah.
Okay, so guys, use the chat. Just brainstorm. You can type in, for example, learning effectiveness, and then just give 1 or 2 examples of possible metrics, and then you do the same for the other metrics, the other requirements. Sorry. In the meantime, let me we're just gonna wait for 1 more minute to hear more from you guys in the chat. I'd just like to comment on something that I think is worth discussing, even if it's just briefly. So in formal education, somebody said, in my formal education world, everything is around learning retention and learning achievement. So in this case, how sticky is the content? Do learners stay with content and so they pass the assessments? Yes, so let me just, maybe it's not exactly what Joe meant here, but it's just an opportunity for me to address something that I really think can be misleading if not addressed properly. So indeed, there's this assumption that the most important trait for a course is engagement. The course should be engaging. Everybody talks about engagement as if it was the primary reason why people learn and people stay with you, and that's at best partially true. So people learn better when we use good didactics. That's what gets people to learn, not engagement. So if you just think about the last movie you watched, I'm guessing it was probably very entertaining. It probably was very nice at the moment, so it was enough to keep you paying attention for 2 entire hours. But can you tell what the movie is about in detail? What have you learned from the movie? What did you learn overall? Like, do you remember any details about the movie, any scene in particular, anything? So it's very much not just possible, but very, very frequent that we study or see things, and these things keep us engaged for long periods of time, and yet we don't learn anything from it. So I'm not saying that engagement is not important. I'm just saying it's not nearly as important as people want us to believe too. So yes, engagement is important. Interactivity is important, but as a means, not as an end in itself. Okay, so back to the presentation. Some very important things in the chat. I hope you, besides typing in your answer, you also had a chance to read what other people are saying, because there are very interesting examples here. Okay, so just a few examples for you to have in your pocket. Learning effectiveness. Some of you actually used very similar wording, so you can measure knowledge gain. For example, you can have a pre-test and compare. So you can test people before they start the course, and then you test it again at the end, and you compare the difference, the delta, or you produce the delta by comparing. You can measure the skill mastery. For example, if your course, and it should have simulations or very practical activities, then you can create a percentage calculating the total attempts and the percentage of the total attempts and the total errors. So you can see how many attempts were necessary for each successful try. And retention, which is a very interesting concept because you can pair these things. So for example, you can measure knowledge gain. You can have pre-test versus post-test score. So that's going to test how much immediate knowledge gain as a result, but also you can say schedule, tests for say 2 weeks later, and then another 4 weeks, and then another 10 weeks. And then we keep measuring to see over time how much of these knowledge is retained, how much of this knowledge is lost. Knowing that the very fact that you're testing contributes to retention, which is awesome, which is what you want. So if you when you test somebody, say 2 weeks after, and then you test again about 4 weeks after, it's not uncommon that the second delayed score is even higher than the previous one, because the previous one contributes to the retention. So just keep that in mind. So you might have to correct for this deviation if you want to. Otherwise, you just be happy that everybody is retaining the knowledge. For learning efficacy, so job relevance, so I can compare the amount of tests that are simulating job-related tasks and the one actually included in your course, and percentage-wise, how much of these you are accounting for in your course, in your online course. Gap closure accuracy is when you identify the number of not the job related tasks as a whole, but specifically those that needed improving. So that's the main difference. And performance correlation in a way also matters for the last one, for impact, and for effectiveness as the previous one. So basically meaning, okay, what proves that I'm teaching the right things is that after people take my course, they really are doing better at their job. So it proves that I'm teaching well and that I'm teaching the right things. And then learning efficiency, as I think Ugo mentioned in the chat, the time to competency, so the average time required to reach proficiency, again measured in the previous metrics. Also attempts to success, also in this case, not just attempts, but it can also, if you're using XAPI, if you don't know what XAPI is, it's how can I explain this? It's a framework that produces and stores learning metrics. And one of the things it can store is, for example, it stores in the format of a sentence. Like this person did such and such, this location with this result, blah, 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 blah. So when comparing these units of data, you can tell how much time it took them in between attempts as well. So it can also measure the amount of time, so the completion time, and also the variance in terms of completion time. For example, in some cases, some people are really, really fast at delivering the course, and some super slow. And then if you just look at the average, it might be misleading because you might think, okay, this is taking more or less what I predicted it would take on average. But if the delta is too big, you might be either teaching the wrong things or maybe the efficiency is not great, because it means that a lot of people who are doing a lot faster, maybe they're going fast because they already know what you're teaching. And the ones who don't know are, it's taking a long time for them to get there. So one way to identify that is comparing the variance, not the average, not looking at the average alone. So functional requirements is like being accessible. So for the most part, is technical stuff. Like, is your course compatible with the LMS or XAPI, whatever language you're using in your LMS, or if you're putting your course in websites and then you don't have a LMS, you just use a learning record store. Is it compatible? Is it sending the right prompts? Is it sending the data in a integral way? Is your course accessible? Does it have enough negative space between letters, between lines? Do you have enough luminous contrast between background and foreground? So this kind of stuff, and functional requirements. And then functional requirements usually, so you can think about usability. It's not the same as accessibility. So accessibility is what I just mentioned, but the usability is like how intuitive it is to find stuff in your course, or even in the LMS if you're also LMS manager. And also in terms of performance, like for example, let's say you're using a super high definition video, and then it takes 5 minutes just to load the video. So that's not really good practice. So your video has to be good enough to be to fulfill its requirements, but one of these requirements is loading faster. So performance also matters here. It's a non-functional requirement. Constraints such as budget, time frame, also something that's very easily neglected is if you have to rely on experts, can you make sure that they are available? If they are, how much time do they actually have, and how much time is it needed for them to deliver what you're planning them, or what you have them to deliver? And then, okay, just in terms of examples, so I just included examples from opportunity gaps and skill decay prevention as well here. So as I said before, performance gap is all about job-related metrics, but opportunity gap, it can be about a new skill set, or it can be about internal redeployments, like moving people laterally inside the organization. And it can be, like, as I said, like new tooling that people are adopting to do things faster, or new things that they were not doing before. And skill decay usually is about having usually don't have content delivered for use for skill decay prevention. Usually it's more hands-on, more practical, and super hyper challenging. So it's about, for example, how many people can successfully renew their certification, or how many of these highly elite professionals, how many of these are taking reinforcement activities, and so on. So these are a few metrics. And again, these are just examples, right? So the real metrics in your case is gonna be dependent on the specific project that you're developing. And this is all just step one, okay? And I just wanted to do step one a bit slowly, so that we can do at least one in a more detailed fashion, and then the next steps are gonna be moving a little bit faster, just to give you a glimpse of the whole procedure. So the second step after when you started your action mapping is to identify what people need to do. So the tasks and the behaviors people have to do to achieve those metrics that you established. So first step, you establish the metrics, then what people need to do to achieve them. Then you can start conceiving or creating practical activities that can simulate the activities from the previous item. So you can see that here the sequence matters, because every subsequent item depends on the previous one. So how can you identify what people need to do if you don't know the goal, if you don't know the metrics? So you have to know the metrics to identify what people need to do. And then you have to identify what people need to do so that we can conceive the practical activities that simulate those things. And once you do that, then and only then you start thinking about the content. So here you see, this is the first time I'm talking about content. And usually we start from the content, right? And that's what I said at the beginning. This is a very bad practice. So content is one of the last things you think about when it comes to scope. And then you identify if the performance can be improved by improving skill, knowledge, attitude, culture, or any other thing, because you might well discover that training will not fix your problem, because maybe the reason why you're not achieving those metrics is not a lack of skill or knowledge. It's just the wrong attitude, or it's just because people don't have the right tools, or maybe the processes are either flawed or lacking. So then in this case, you can still contribute because you can highlight that, but it's not, you won't fix it with training. So it's very important that at this stage, you're able to identify that. So visually, so usually do this second step more visually, and it looks more or less like this. So you have the metrics that we spent some time talking about in the center. And this is, again, just step one. Then step two, go in, around that, you brainstorm or start deciding on not brainstorm, because these things are what people actually do in their day-to-day jobs, the actual tasks they do. But then you're gonna rate each of them for their impact on value. So how critical are each of these things to deliver the results, to deliver the metrics that you say listed. And then for each of these tasks, then you brainstorm activities, usually practical activities, and then you're going to do the same. You're going to rate them in terms of how easy or how complex they are to be implemented, to be created and implemented, and your confidence that these tasks, these activities, these practices can really, really prepare people to do the job that they are supposed to do. So, for example, let's say we're talking about here, I don't know, de-escalating a conversation if you are, customer success manager, or if you're, working customer support. So you're working customer support, and one of your jobs is to make sure that the customer is happy. So, and if somebody has a complaint, they're escalating the conversation, they're really upset, really angry, and their job is to de-escalate that. So let's suppose this is one of your metrics. So de-escalation has a metric. Then let's say the task is, talk to the person via chat, and the activity. So I can brainstorm 3 different activities. So let's say, for example, one of the possibilities is at the lower end, meaning the easiest, but also the one you have the least confidence in terms of how transferable that skill is. You can have, for example, 3 or 4 possible answers to a question that the customer does. So the customer does ask you a question, and then I have to pick 1 out of 4 options. What's the most appropriate way of answering the customer without escalating, or maybe contributing to the de-escalation? And then you just have to pick, right? So you just have to recognize what the best option is. So that's very easy, right? You just have to script, text. It can even be text-based. You just copy, paste, make the screen pretty, and that's it. So it takes a few minutes, if that much. Super easy. But I'm not sure if that's really replicable in a real life situation. Maybe in a real life situation, because the question is slightly different, or the customer is slightly angrier, or whatever the reason may be, you don't know how to respond, or you don't remember, right? So maybe let's go one level more. Let's say instead of choosing between options, you have to type in the answer. That's more complicated, right? Because then maybe you have to have a engine behind so that you can correct the text, or maybe provide some meaningful feedback. But at the very least, they have to actually write their response, right? Or maybe it's a human given feedback. So maybe have a person, a tutor, reviewing all the answers and then providing a feedback. So that's less easy. That's more complex, but the confidence level is higher. Or maybe let's go one level still. Let's say they have to do the same thing. They have to type in the real answer, but it's not a person doing anything, or it's not just a generic feedback. Maybe it could be AI agent, on the background, reading your answer, providing you feedback, maybe even giving you follow-up questions for you to further reflect on your answer, etc., etc. So that's probably very much replicable and transferable, but it's a lot more complicated to do, because then you have to have AI in-house, and there's some work to set it up. Of course, after it's done, it's scalable, but still it's not simple. In terms of cybersecurity, you're increasing your attack surface, so it's not simple. It's more complicated. It's more expensive, at least at first, after being scalable. So that's more or less the rationale. So how you balance, easiness or complexity and confidence level, or the degree of uncertainty, to how critical or meaningful the practice is for each task. And then, and only then, you think about the content. And here, the content, you should also think about the content in terms of if the content is something that people have to know, so meaning that it's something that you have to explain or to describe. So it could be a procedure that is very simple procedure, like where to find something to be downloaded, or a recipe or whatever, or it could be a concept, could be an idea, a principle, a value. So that's something you just have to explain, or it could be something that you have to demonstrate, you have to experience, not by doing, but at the very least by watching. So this is something demonstrated. It could be a screenshot, it could be a video, it could be anything that I can see happening. So it's not static; it's moving in front of my eyes. And 3, if the content is not literally a content, it's more like a simulation. So it's not about content in its strict sense. It's more about a skill. So in this case, the content is not to be explained or described or demonstrated. People just have to do something. So then in this case, it's empty. But you do have to think about this because you're going to start seeing the relationship that you can see on the screen. So in some cases, the same content can be applicable to different tasks. So in reality, so this is because I'm doing just one task, but once you do this for the entire set of job-related tasks, the end result is going to look like a net, a very imbricated net. And that's when you see the more relevant content, the content that is connected to more tasks, which in turn are connected to more job-related tasks, and which in turn are more critical or less critical to the goals. And then the scope of your course doesn't have to be everything. On the contrary, it shouldn't be everything. You should pick the best value for money. In this case, quite literally, the best value for money. So the tasks that are, say, fairly transferable, but not so expensive. So should I build my scope only with the cheapest, but then less reliable? Yeah, probably I'm gonna be meeting my constraints in terms of budgeting, but I won't meet my constraints in terms of quality, in terms of impact, in terms of all the other metrics. So when you have all of your metrics in mind, which set of activities are more likely to deliver all of them? So that's the bottom line question that you have to have at all times at the back of your head. Again, feel free to ask me questions if I'm rushing too much. And then, super quickly, as I said, the next one is going to be quicker. When I said top-down or bottom-up approach, is because usually when you have a sponsor asking you to deliver a training course, usually it goes from top-down or from bottom-up, meaning the sponsor says, I want you to achieve these goals, but I have no idea how you're going to do that. Or like, okay, here's a PowerPoint presentation. Make sure it looks like a course and make sure it looks nice and people are happy, etc., etc. But you have to remember, because of action mapping teaches us, there is no direct connection between top-down and bottom-up, because action mapping will always be in between. So action mapping is the perfect bridge between purely content-based courses and purely abstract demands that you might receive. So action mapping usually is the best way to start when you don't have so much clarity on either side, on the more concrete side or on the more abstract side. So a quick example of a top-down approach: say a sponsor comes to you and say, okay, so please just launch a global initiative. So let's create some e-learning that ensures that all employees understand AI ethics policy. That's it. So do that. So the sponsor knows the big idea, knows where he wants to go or she wants to go or they wants to go, but they don't know how. So you go top down in the sense that you go from the strategic directive, and then from that point you derive the metrics that we discussed, the high level goals and the metrics. Then you align, you make sure, because you are the one doing this job, then you have to liaise with the stakeholders to make sure that your understanding really is what they had in mind. Maybe they don't even know before you say it, but when you say it, they go, yeah, that was it. Yeah, you got it. But actually you invented. They didn't know it beforehand. And then, and only then, you go through the rest of the procedure that we discussed. So after you establish the metrics, then you go through with your action mapping, doing the next steps. So it's top down because you start from the abstract idea, abstract goal, the high level goal, and then you make your way down to the content. And the opposite is also true. So say, again, as I said, you receive a PowerPoint presentation, and then you just like, the guy just says, do your magic, and then you don't even know where to start. So usually from the pre-existing content, you also have to try to derive. You can make the inverse engineering. So from this content is related to which tasks, which in turn are related to which job-related tasks, which in turn are related to which metrics, etc., etc. So make from your content, from the say a PowerPoint or a video or a website, you'll make your way to the most abstract metrics. So it's the inverse logic, but the procedure or the map is the same. So it still has to look like your action map. So it's bottom up because it starts at the content level, and then you end or you land at the more abstract goals. And quite often you have something in between. So somebody says, for example, create a course to teach agents how to de-escalate customer complaints effectively. So that's closer to top down, but it's still in the middle because you still don't have the metrics, and you still don't have the top level goal. So you still have to derive that. So you cannot think just because they know the behavior that they want to change, that's good enough to be your goal. It's not. So you still have to elaborate on that. Maybe even get surrounding goals or derive metrics from there as well. And then we say it's top down and bottom up at the same time, because you have to go both ways. From that briefing, you go all the way up to establish the goals and the metrics, and all the way down to the content to establish all the micro details that I have to account for. So to wrap up and summarize what we discussed, so the action map is in my opinion, the ultimate technique, the ultimate framework to help you create this bridge between the top level and the bottom level, the content level and the numbers and the metrics. And it takes a lot of practice to do that. And the more people involved, the better. So if you do this on your own, okay, it's probably going to work. But if you have a team, because there's a lot of activities here that's dependent on brainstorming and alignment. So make sure it's a one-off. So you don't sit down and just do the whole thing and then it's done. Usually you do a draft, then you realign, you check, you liaise, you ask questions, you iterate. So this takes quite some time to get it right. And the second takeaway, again, for price as promised. So remember, our goal is to keep the online course as lean as possible, as objective as possible, because it literally costs you a lot of money. So this is just a baseline, just an idea in terms of range, how much it can cost you to develop online course. If you do the math for a half an hour course, 1 hour course, a 10-hour course, which is not so much, so the cost can escalate really, really quickly. So if you're just want to have, because your company is super fancy, just want to have the most beautiful course, then it's going to cost you 10,000 euro just to make it look nice. Think again, because you might be spending a lot of money and you won't achieve any results if you don't scope it correctly. So everything starts with the scope, and if your scope is good, you're in a very strong position to do everything else productive and reach the desired goals. And keep on rocking. That was what I had. Thank you for your attention, for your time. I know how busy everybody is these days, so thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I'm happy to take any questions you have in case I have time to stay a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there is already one question, and I think it's worth answering it for everybody. So question from Kirsten is, What is the best way to become a great e-learning designer? Do you have tips on good resources to learn about e-learning didactics and design?
I do. I think the very first step, if you want to be, okay, there's a nuance to that. If by successful we mean having a fancy job or a nice job, then it's a different type of question. Now, if by great we mean be really good at what you do, I would say start studying the learning sciences, but the real learning sciences, because there's a lot of pseudoscience out there and heuristic things that are not science-based. For example, everybody talks about learning styles, which is not true. It's like being debunked for decades, not for years, for decades. People talk about Bloom's taxonomy, which is just a heuristic framework at best, so it's not scientific at all. So studying the learning sciences, studying accessibility helps a lot, because you learn, for example, as Edwards, I was talking to Becky in Raw just a few minutes before we started. For example, you can have a lots of white letters, white font on a screen on a dark background, and then you have a green button, and you think that the green button is highlighted because it's a different color, when actually it's the opposite, because our eyes look for the brightest thing to look first. So if you want to highlight something, make sure it's bright, it's brighter than the rest. So it's it's optics thing. It's a neurological function that, if you know that, it's really useful for you to create your online course, because then what you want to do, you want to drive and manipulate in a good way the user's attention, because we're going to learn the things that our attention is at, right? So start from the science, and from there you start challenging yourself, creating things and testing things on real people, and check if people are really are learning. So the best way to learn is using metrics, because then you can track your own performance.
All right, thank you very much. So there are a lot of agreements saying absolutely, science of learning is a must, a lot of thank yous. So I think this was great insights actually of your work. And also thank you very much for all of you engaging in these comments and in the chat. Yeah, if you want to see more of these insights, more of these sessions, you're very welcome to meet us in December in Berlin live on site. There is another question that I'll put up in a minute. And yeah, if you're also interested in bringing your own ideas, your own topics, then you're also more than welcome to use our call for proposal that is still open until the end of this month. You find all the information on oeb.global. You can always contact us there as well. And I think, Chaim, you're also, you can be like, people can connect with you on LinkedIn or something like that if there are more.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely,
So
yes.
great. So there was one saying tips on good science of learning, was another comment here with a question mark. Maybe this as a last word. And then, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So that's very easy, actually. So a good science of learning, like good science in general. So good science, it means it has to be replicable and has to be peer reviewed. So good science of learning is when, if you have to read the source, if you just rely on videos on the internet or summaries or ChatGPT, these kind of things, then in a very strong position. So my advice is read the actual paper, the actual research, and check, for example, if that research is published in a respectable source. Two, if the number of subjects is meaningful, or was it an experiment with just 5 people or 12 people? Has it been replicated in other contexts, in other places, with other people? So the amount of people matters, the review aspect matters, so this kind of thing. So that applies not only to learning science, but also any science, really. So I'll look for that.
All right, that was, I think, a great last sentence for for this workshop today. So thank you very much, yeah, for your insights. Thank you for engaging here, for your time, and hope to see you maybe again on another OEBcast, and then maybe on site in Berlin in December. We wish you all a great rest of your day, and yes, a great week. Thank you.
Thank you all. See you next time. Bye.